work for that inclusion. At the same time, big organizations like East Bay Regional Parks, National Park Service, some of the big museums like the Smithsonian are saying, we have a whole lot about this, not a lot about that. Why is that? Before we go into the movie, I'm going to talk about something that I wish was in the movie, but it's not. That's the story about Japanese confinement during the war. One of the bigger knife fights that I lost with other Rangers was a squabble over why are certain stories missing, and I lost it, and I just tried my best and couldn't get it in, but let's look at, David, you can't read those rolled pictures. Let's think for a second about where history tends to start. Thank you. Quite often when we start, well, no, don't give it away. Let's try to show it instead of telling it. When we started telling the Japanese story, it was one little movie out of 11. And we started with things like this. Here's a picture, one of hundreds of pictures we have, of a Japanese family that owned nurseries in Richmond and El Cerrito. Fred Korematsu's family owned nurseries in Oakland. There were others in Pacifica, Half Moon Bay, all over the place. So we started with property owners. And when they got sent to the desert and locked up and came back, because they were property owners, they had money, they tended to write more letters, they kept more journals, they took more pictures. So we said, how do we tell that story? We need evidence. So we started with the evidence we could find. Property owners. And those flower growers, they're part of the big Flower Growers Association with Portuguese and Italian folks who started this society. And here they are partying. It's a stag party, all boys on a ship, just making fools of themselves, laying on the ground after a lot of champagne. So we found a lot of evidence, and our first draft of telling the Japanese confinement story was to work from the pictures. But then we took a step back and realized, what kind of people are represented? Property owners. Who's not represented then? Were all the Japanese Americans property owners?
No.
Okay. So we made this, I could call it an error, or we made an effort that wasn't perfect, where we said, look at the old nurseries. They're beat down. They're going to fall down tomorrow, but they're rugged, and they're a symbol of the Japanese people and their endurance. Well, that's kind of cool if you're one of those families. I'm making sense so far?
Yeah.
But while 100% of the property owners, the Japanese property owners in Richmond, came back to their property because their posse of Italian and Portuguese flower growers were looking after most of their properties. Most, not all. Some of the properties were robbed and thrashed. But most of them were looked after. The banks even forgave some of their mortgages or froze them until they came back. We know that, so we know all the property owners came back. But then we learned from doing research that less than 50% of the Japanese came back to California. Starting in 1943, we saw, or late 1942, a lot of cities and counties started passing resolutions. We don't want the Japanese back here after the war. Send them to Japan, South America, but not back here. The code words were, it's going to be dangerous for them. I didn't know this until about 8 months ago. So I had this before and after picture. They were here, we took them to the desert, and I guess they came back. But half of them are gone. Where are they? Why don't we know about them? That's what I sounded like. Trying the best I could. I was at Cal Berkeley's library, Stanford's, I was everywhere. Do you know what happened to the brother who lived on that corner? Or the guy who was paid by the hour and helped out? Do we know what happened to him? I don't know. And after a while, I found out one became a medical student, went to New Jersey, another one here. But where are the other hundreds? So we have an uneven story. History starts with uneven stories. And we can say, I'm going to get you because you left my people out, or who's going to start doing the work to get those people in. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So public history, not just of Japanese Americans, but of Americans, often starts with property owners. They just leave more traces. Thank God all of you have thumb drives. So regardless of how much we're getting paid, there's a bit more evidence of us, and your Facebook pages and other things are going to give us a little hint. But back in 1941 and 1830, there wasn't as much evidence of people who weren't property owners. So the story you're going to read or see is very uneven, but it's a start. I want you to look at the Richmond story with me. It's about 15 minutes long. It'll all give us a kind of shared starting place.
Great.
And after that, I want to know what kind of questions do you have about that period? We can go a lot of directions, but I really want to respect your interest. So afterwards, we'll start right in by just kind of listing questions people have and seeing what we can do to address them.
Thank you.
Everybody here, right?
I fell in love with it. Everything was wide open and rough and wild. The conditions for growing are really, really good in Richmond. Lots of sunlight, and it's not too hot. It's kind of a combination of industry and semi-rural landscape that most people remember. They would have vegetable gardens and a cow tethered out behind their home and walk up to McDonald Avenue to do their shopping.
Richmond was a working man's town. You had the Pullman coach refurbishing factories there.
Standard Oil, the railroad, and later the Ford Assembly Building. Kind of a working class community.
You had a diversity of ethnicities and races living in Richmond. Italian Americans and African Americans, the Japanese American population, Chinese population, Native American, Indian population as well, of course, as Mexican American. Kaiser plant located there before Pearl Harbor. Richmond had a really good deepwater harbor, perfect for the shipping industry. It had lots of open space. But it also had a working force.
The attack yesterday on the Hawaiian Islands has caused severe damage.
It was absolute horror. We were in total shock and terror because we were being told immediately that we might be bombed, and we had to immediately go into blackout mode.
When we got into the war, there was a big demand. We had to have ships, we had to have everything. I heard on my car radio, women, do something for your country. Go to the Richmond shipyard and be a welder. I had not the faintest idea what it was. I just knew that it was something that they needed done real bad, and I decided that that's what I was gonna do.
Built that suitcase, got it on a train and came to California and stayed with my sister, Caroline.
We all thought we could make money working in the shipyards. Father was the type of man that looked for better jobs, that he wanted me with him.
Henry J. Kaiser, you know, he brought a lot of people back from the South to work in the shipyards.
For African American Southerners, the most frequently given graduation gift was not a watch or a typewriter, but a train or bus ticket out to the West.
In 2 years, little Richmond of 23,000 has become a bustling metropolis of 130,000. This fabulous growth necessitated civic expansion.
Richmond's population exploded physically, but also in terms of cultural and social and even political differences that made living together and working together a challenge.
I remember always sleeping in crowded conditions.
There wasn't enough housing for anybody.
Some were living in a truck, some living in a car. Everybody was taking in roomers. I had a roommate. I worked swing shift. She worked graveyard. We slept in the same bed.
That way I could sleep in the daytime and they could sleep in the bed at night. In downtown Richmond was just seething with people.
Lots of people on the streets. I mean, like 4th of July or like Cinco de Mayo.
Grocery stores were open 24 hours. Everything was open 24 hours a day during that time.
Everything was moving. The energy was everywhere.
You had clubs like Minnie Lou's Restaurant and Blues Club in North Richmond. And then there was, of course, this enormously popular club called Tappers Inn. It was a nightclub, a blues club, and they had sort of in the back room the slot machines and card games and things like that.
It was a busy, happening, good town. People had jobs, and there was optimism, and there was an energy. In addition to the shipyards, there were 55 other defense-related industries in Richmond, so there were workers moving in all directions. Everybody was working towards the same goal. We wanted to bring the boys home.
I went to the hiring hall and they said, you have to join the Boilermakers Union. So I went there and this man, stern, big, and said, we don't take any women or blacks. The next day I went back to the hiring hall and they gave me the same story and I started crying. And there was a man sitting at a desk and he says, go back up there. And they hired me.
But then when they brought in the women, oh my land, the men laughed at them terribly at first. You know, look at her walk, look at her. She doesn't even know how to hold a hammer.
There were tensions in the workplace that related to both race and gender. There were people who said, I'm not going to work with a black person, and there were men who said, I'm not going to work alongside a woman. So we talk about unity during World War II, but there were lots and lots of bridges that had to be built.
In the case of Kaiser, the labor unions, particularly the Boilermakers Union, began reluctantly to accept first women and then African Americans, men and women. The momentum to challenge Jim Crow that really launched the modern civil rights movement grew out of the Double V campaign that African Americans pushed for victory over the enemies abroad, but also over Jim Crow at home. The Pittsburgh Courier really was behind launching this campaign for African Americans to challenge and defeat segregation, discrimination based on race, in housing, in the workplace, in schools.
I went to Richmond High and was taught welding, and I worked at Kaiser's, but I never worked side by side with no, you know, on the same ship with a man welding.
I'll tell you what, the women were the best welders. If you give the woman the job she does that job. That's what it's done, right?
It was like creating an embroidery in metal. I could point out that was a man's weld, and that was a woman's weld, because they look different. The men's isn't as uniform.
We worked for hours, and we did twice work the men did.
A new world shipbuilding record is set at one of Henry J. Kaiser's California shipyards. 24 days ago, just a keel plate.
Henry Kaiser was a genius.
He started one of the first health plans, and he started a place for people to live and things that people didn't have before.
He developed the child care centers to accommodate the children needing care while their parents were at work.
And here's the man who built them in record time. Henry J. Kaiser with a model to show how it's done. Built to scale, the 14-foot model is made of 81 feet.
Everything was prefabbed under Kaiser, where they had the big sheets of steel and they weld those together and then move them by crane onto the ship.
We call them the Horley cranes. They were so enormous, and they would lift these massive pieces of metal and boxes, and they were just one of the biggest things I'd ever seen.
That's how come ships could be built so fast. Parts would be welded together and ready to be put onto a ship in no time.
Our motto was 10 down the ways in 31 days.
Down the ways. They would slide that ship down into the San Francisco Bay. Rain or shine, ships quietly slipped into San Francisco Bay, faster and faster. By the fall of 1943, more than one ship a day left Richmond. Most colossal shipbuilding spectacle the world has ever witnessed.
They were always giving speeches and telling us how the other yards, how fast they were getting a ship built, so there was always competition.
And I remember when we worked on the rubber Peary, which was built, by the way, I think is, the record has it either 3.5 or 4.5 days from beginning to finish. And I think that's an amazing team.
The launching at Yard 1 and 2 were particularly festive occasions. They got famous people from all over the country. Ship would go sliding down the ways right after the champagne was cracked over the bow. Very ceremonial.
It was a patriotic time. You'd see the kids collecting newspapers, collecting tinfoil, collecting anything. Women, they gave up all their girdles, all their underwear that had elastic.
It really was the most wonderful time of coming together of the American people that I have ever lived through.
It wasn't as if the shipyards closed and some balloon burst and Richmond was depopulated. It really continued to be a thriving community.
Today, I think you have waves of newcomers who have that kind of vibrancy that those newcomers during the wartime had. Richmond, it was called the city that won the Purple Heart because of the amount of change and crowding in the war effort and turning out those ships in record numbers. Something happened in the small town of Richmond that people should be very proud of.
I was very proud of myself that I worked in the shipyards. Proud of myself because I thought we were doing something for the war effort.
From that point on, I always thought, I can do anything I want to do. If I set my mind to it, I can do anything. And that's how I've lived the rest of my life.
This was the place to be. What sticks with me the most was how wonderful everybody was to to each other, very patriotic and pulling together, and it was just a good time.
That's what makes the story so interesting, that these were ordinary people who did extraordinary things.
Miles, you got it?
Yeah.
All right. So, I'd like to know where you went while you were watching this. I'm going to do a shortened version of an activity I love called See, Think, Wonder, where I want to ask you 2 questions. Would you, if you like, take a moment to tell us something that you saw or learned, and then while we're listening to other people, share something that they noticed or learned in the story. I want you to reflect by yourself a couple moments to think about something you want to know after seeing this much, okay? So if anyone would like to share something that they saw, learned, noticed. Is it Gabby?
Yeah.
Gabby.
Yeah. We're always talking a lot about racism, but we also forget that sexism is something that affects us a lot.
Mhm.
And seeing that they actually came together, like instead of just saying like, I don't want to work along the black person, they also said, I don't want to work along the woman. And that's something we tend to forget.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, personally, I saw a familiar face because Margaret Archie, she actually goes to my church. She actually, I haven't seen her in quite a while. I'm afraid she might have passed on, but I remember seeing her face, and I remember embracing her, knowing her personally, conversating with her.
Yeah.
And while I was watching it, I was reflecting on how they were talking about, oh, there were such happy days, such happy days. People came together. People came together, and question that kept coming to my mind is, why does it take war for us to come together? That's all I think about. Why does it take war for us to work hand in hand and get with a black person or a woman? Why does it take?
Okay.
Yeah. Why does it take that? That's all I was.
Thank you. Others? Anyone else?
Laila. To add on to what David said, it's like, I feel like, even then, they didn't really have a choice but to work together, People, I feel like they still didn't want to work with a Hispanic person or a black person. They didn't really want to work with a woman, but I think they kind of had to. Maybe some people did, pull through and, be like, maybe I can work with this person. Maybe we can even be friends. And I feel like a lot of it was during that time, they're fighting, how it said, they're fighting to beat segregation and discrimination during World War II. And just, I feel like they wanted to earn that, like, humanity and that respect. And even then, like, it still took a lot longer. 20 years later, we're finally allowed to vote after World War II. So that's a key step.
Thank you. Let me just interject a couple things. First, she's bringing us back to one of the points I made before the film when I was introducing Richmond. Namely, Richmond is used as the example, both because it was extreme. Richmond built the largest shipyards in the world, the fastest shipyards in the world. 27 slots built 747 ships. Richmond's population grew more than 4 times its size in just a few years. 23,000 to 100 and something thousand. So everyone's wondering, like, where did everybody come from? And I hope he goes back. He can stay, but I hope these other people go back. It was big, extreme, and it was temporary. So people are both saying, it's like being on that hump on the roller coaster. On the other side, is everyone staying here, or is it going down like it was before? And is the economy staying here, or is it going down? So we're seeing big changes, and one of the difficulties we often have is trying to figure out when a big change is lasting or temporary. And she's pointing out that what looked kind of joyous and unified was, in some ways, it was temporary, and we can also ask, was the unity total? to what extent did we achieve wartime unity, and to what extent were people kind of chafing, like, I'm still not sure. Remember that moment where you saw a sister, I'm gonna guess she was Latino or Filipino. She's wearing a hard hat, and she had a kind of hard look.
Yeah.
Remember that? And the voice was saying there's a lot of people who didn't want to work with a man or with a woman. And we had to build, what was her saying? She said, we'd like to talk about unity when we talk about World War II, but as Lael is saying, but we had to build a lot of bridges to get there. So one of our questions is, did we build enough bridges? What worked then? Any recipes from then that we want to copy? Any recipes we should have used more of back then? So, if other people want to jump into stage one, try to, if you can trim your this intense activity in your brain. Let's do the kind of low calorie thing first, which is what's just something you saw. And trust I'm going to come right back to you and ask you what's something that you're reflecting on or thinking about. That way, we're just buying time for people who might need a few more seconds to think about where they want to go. So, you know, we're flying close to the ground for a few seconds. What's something you saw in the film? Sophie?
Another thing I saw was like how the energy was changed. Because like now like I noticed like how it's kind of like, it's like there, but it's not as like as we've seen in the film. Like everybody was moving around, and they said like all the stores and like all restaurants and diners were open 24/7. And that the energy was just so different, and that it was like affecting one another, like everything was moving, it was so alive here. And that now like to see it around, like it's not that alive anymore, it's almost there, but it's not as it was in the film back then.
Now let's switch gears. What's something that you want to know, or something that you, or something you want to know, or what other questions come to mind? Roman first, then Andres.
They talked about Henry Kaiser a lot, and I was kind of wondering like what his role was, and kind of like, because they were saying how he was a genius and all that, but I was wondering if how much of it was really just him, or did he profit off others and become well known for that?
Thank you. My second was Andres.
I had a question about pay, like were the workers, they were working, were they getting enough, or were they still struggling, having to really rely on sharing? Like the sharing, was that because of love, or was it because of they needed it?
Necessity, yeah, thank you. 3 questions. Phoenix?
Yeah, I have a question. I kind of, like you said, the population of Richmond like quadrupled, times 4. And it kind of just came to me like about gentrification in the Bay Area. And I'm just kind of curious about like how the people who have been living there for a long time and like were there when there was a small amount of people felt about all these new people coming. I'm just curious about like their opinion on all these new people.
Thank you. Good question. How many generations? I'm going to call on you next. Is it Courtney? Okay, in a second. Before we go to Courtney, try to guess how many generations of a family might have grown up in Richmond. Let's say your great-great-great someone came in 1941 for a job. But you started building ships for Britain in Richmond a year before Pearl Harbor. January 1941, they started building ships for Richmond, for Britain. December 41 was Pearl Harbor. Okay, so people are coming pretty early. Starting at January 41, how many generations of a new Richmond family do you think might have lived there if they stayed in Richmond between 41 and now? 2. Okay. Let's say you're 20. How old might you be when you have kids?
30, 25.
Okay. Okay, so it might be, you could be looking back at your grandparents maybe, or great-grandparents. Okay. Courtney.
My question was that since they came together to build the ships, how come they didn't stay together?
Thank you. Jake.
Yeah, you touched on this a little earlier, and I was sort of wondering about what the dynamics were that caused, even if it was short-term, people to have great sacrifice. And sort of like what that was a function of, if it was partially propaganda or necessity, and how that, if that same type of thing could be applied with problems there.
Another great question. All these great questions. Has anyone heard of the Office of War Information? We started a large, a pretty powerful department in the federal government called the Office of War Information. It was a propaganda office. And they didn't just make cool posters. They said, hey, General Motors, hey, Ford, Cadillac, GE, you can't make blenders right now because we need your metal for a ship. You can't make cars right now. We need your metal for a Jeep. But we'll pay your advertising department to make posters for us. Right now we want posters about recruitment. And the men are playing tricks on the women, and that ain't right. They're cutting down on productivity. So right now we need posters about cooperation. Remember the We Can Do It poster? Yellow and blue? That was from the cooperation set. How do we get the men to quit playing tricks on Rosie the Riveter? Then they choose other themes. We need people to save so that we'll have more gas to send to the troops. We need people to grow their own victory garden, they called it, so there'll be more canned tomatoes to send to Pacific Ocean. So the social messaging of 70 years ago was a highly coordinated set of radio and posters and other things. I almost went into my Ranger trance, I apologize. But add that to this question. If we don't have that kind of office doing that now, what kind of messaging today could do that kind of work? Other questions, other things you want to know about? Okay, thank you.
So I want to know, like, I know that this kind of showed like that women and black people, they can actually work and stuff like that. Like they weren't like, oh, well, they're just useless. But like, what happened like right after? Like, did they go back to like not working? Because I know like they were willing for the ships to go out, but when the war was over, like what were they doing at the job and stuff like that? If they worked with that.
Yeah, great question.
Because like, you know, like, history is like my favorite subject, and I know like a lot about like World War II. It's kind of funny to think that like people like the Tuskegee Airmen, they would go fight for their country, fight for all these people to free them, and they come back, and it's kind of like, you know, segregation. And one thing I kind of wonder about is like during this time, like when they're building all these ships and stuff, like did they truly learn to love all these different people? Or was it just like, you know, like everybody's been mentioning, and you were saying like a temporary thing? Like, did it really change them? Did they really, you know, continue to sacrifice for the rest of their lives? Or did it just, you know, we're just going to do this because of the war, and it's not going to affect us, you know, after?
One of the things I admire about a lot of your questions, coming to you in a moment, is that you beat me to my follow-up, which is, okay, good question, why do you want to know that? About wartime unity and whether it was lasting or temporary, and was it real? Was the need, was the sharing based on love and a new wartime spirit? We got to share our Campbell soup because Godzilla's outside and you need strength too to help me in the morning. Or is it, I have to because I can't afford to buy my own soup? So I admire the way that you're both clicking to a question you want, but you're asking yourself, why do I want to know this? And I appreciate your churning to get to that point. That's in part because even if I take all 7 hours that Roy has offered me, kidding, we won't be able to answer all the questions, huh?
Sounds good to me.
We're going to answer a lot of them, and if I don't answer it, or we don't answer it together, then bring it up again. Hey man, can we talk about the so-and-so? But in any classroom, when you go back to your high school classroom, when you're in college, when you're at your job, there's something to be gained by listening to how your peers connect with something. Because, like I said at the beginning, how fun is it when someone comes in and shows off everything they know? And you're thinking, I already know about ducks, I want to know about geese. I know about ships, I don't know about jeeps. I know about blacks and race, I don't know about gender and women. So by hearing where other people are, you're going to pick up some of these threads later. You can say, Andres, Raphael didn't cover this, but I learned this from my family or something. Abel? Abel.
So, like, even if there was so much unity and like so many people coming in, I wonder like if minorities had equal rights and equal pay among like the same jobs, like whether it be blacks, Hispanics, women, if they had the same paying or same benefits as.
Yeah. So I probably don't need to ask this, but why do you want to know something like that?
I just want to see like how it benefited like each class or each like group of people, and like how this wartime effort, like if it benefited a group, one group more than another.
Does your understanding of history lead you to suspect that they might not have been paid the same? One of the first questions a lot of people ask is, did the women, did the people of color, did the senior citizens, did the child laborers, did the summer high school helpers, did they make the same as the so-and-sos? And they didn't. They did and they didn't. Were there other hands up? I'm going to answer you and ask you to help me.
Ms. Allen, would you like a chair?
Kind of, yeah. That was good. Place where I walk, my head's really large, so just sort of move it, okay?
I'm just asking Marlon to come over here more.
Yeah.
It won't make you feel bad because thank you.
Great, thanks, thank you. Tell me what these questions will be.
Jake, go ahead.
So I study a lot of history, and one thing that I have noticed after any sort of change is there tends to be a significant and severe backlash to a lot of things, like with the black codes or with Jim Crow. Or I'd even argue right now we have a backlash against progress. And was there any significant backlash during this time to people being forced, or maybe forced might not be the right word, I don't quite fully know the context, but having to significantly change who they work with.
There were, let's say this, there were lots of unproductive responses to that coming together in the shipyards and all these, and in the grocery store and other places. Help me find a word for it. One, we know that before Pearl Harbor, in that first year when we were building ships in Richmond for Great Britain, there were less than 80,000 women in defense jobs around the country. By the end of the war, it would be 18 million.
What?
But at first, it was 80,000. And at first, men protested against sharing manly jobs with women. And whites protested sharing these jobs with non-whites, especially the skilled jobs. We also know that there were over 200 hate strikes organized by whites when blacks were either hired in various places or advanced from unskilled jobs to skilled jobs. There were riots in 33 or 34 large American cities and many small towns. People move from one place to another. The place they move to suddenly needs a lot of workers, but they don't have that many apartments waiting for all these new job migrants. So people are I hear the Monterey Apartments has 12 rooms opening up. They're building a new wing. Who's going to get them? I hear they're for women, so they come with their pitchforks. I hear they're going for blacks. There are riots over housing.
Yeah.
There are riots over job classifications. The closest this film gets to that is that moment where the sister with the heart has given the stern look that people don't want to work next to so-and-sos. And we could say a lot more about that. If I had got my, if I had time to do this, one of my slide programs here, there's a program about wartime unity that I started out with a slide of Godzilla. Because I'd argue there's a story we tell ourselves in America about how we might have our divisions, but when there's an external threat that's large enough, do
Yeah.
you see where I'm going?
Yeah.
Those divisions melt. I mean, I care for people like Phoenix, but if Godzilla's this tall, then I'm gonna call him up and say, will you help me? I'm gonna call up Juliana and say, I can't build the ship, but we need to get out there before Godzilla gets here. But a lot of people, even after Pearl Harbor, would say, Godzilla's not that tall, actually. I'd still like to hold on to the world the way it was before Pearl Harbor. Okay. So there's cause for reflection. On one side, one of the most popular threads about World War II at home is that wartime unity was beautiful and total. And if we look below the shiny surface of that, we can ask, how did they get there, when they got there, and where are the places that they didn't go, where they didn't achieve that? How much of this film was about locking up our Japanese neighbors in the racetracks and the county fairgrounds, and then shipping them out 10,000 at a time to the deserts? How much of that film?
Zero.
How much of it was about race riots? Or men playing tricks on Rosie? Hey honey, will you go get the truck? Or Charlotte, can you find me a left-handed hammer? Are you Charlotte? Okay. Can you find me a left-handed hammer sugar pie, they'd say. Then someone says, where's Charlotte? And where's Sophia? And the guys would lie and say, they weren't that serious in the first place. Why are they doing that? It's one thing to say sexism, but let's dig below. What was the economy like before World War II? Do you know anything about the Great Depression? Yeah, in the Depression. Yeah.
Nobody really had jobs. It was, I think, well, I don't know like that much about the Great Depression. I know more about World War II, but I do know that like 25% of the entire country was unemployed.
Yeah.
And that's one thing that I do know. And
That's
men
super important.
were the ones that were working. Like until World War II, women really didn't work unless they like really had to.
Yeah, thank you. And you hit on the core piece of it, that many Americans were unemployed, and a lot of Americans who had jobs were underemployed. Like now, we could say X number have jobs, but how many have enough of a job? My mom used to say, boy, you need to keep that little piece of job. A lot of people had a piece of a job. And they were nervous during the war. They get a paycheck and they say, I don't know if the war's gonna last 10 hours or 10 years.
Right.
What do I do with this paycheck? Should I keep it? You see where I'm going? So they're nervous about how long this better cash flow is going to last. And when it ends and they start cutting back jobs, then am I still in the economy? Can I afford it? So they start undercutting each other. All I know is I'm not competing with women until they're throwing sharp elbows. Okay. One of the ways that employers and unions set that up was by giving women and blacks a different union classification. Not everywhere, but in some unions. So this gets the question, someone asked about equal pay, about. Let's say you have two people doing the same thing. They're sweeping or they're welding or something else. They'd often call the men an apprentice and the women a trainee. The science is equal pay for equal work in a Kaiser yard, but sorry honey, you're just a trainee, so I can't pay you. You say, I'm doing the same work as a bell is. You say,
Just the label. Just the label.
yeah, it's just a label. So they had, many unions made up rules. Negroes and women get these labels no matter what they're doing. Okay. But there are also cases where the opposite happened, where women and men made 95 cents an hour as a starting welder. Phyllis Gould, one of our Richmond shipyard welders, lost her husband over that. He couldn't bear the thought. She's a woman in the film who says, Kaiser hired me. Because of the rules, they had a closed shop, which meant all the federal defense jobs were union jobs. That meant you had to get in 2 doors to get your job. The employer has to say yes, then they say you're in this union if the union says yes. So Kaiser says yes, you go to the union, and the union says, what was the line? We don't take
Women and blacks.
We don't take women or blacks. So she cried, and someone says, you go back up there. So Phyllis went up again and again, and she finally got in. When her husband learned what she was making, he said, "What? I break up with you." So there was equal pay, and that caused some friction, and there was very unequal pay in some other respects. And people were nervous about what rung of the ladder they'd be on when all of that was over. Think about how people making 95 cents an hour would suddenly have a reason to wish that the war could last a long time. You know, that's one kind of economy. And are there other kinds of economy that could float their boats? That's another question. One of the other questions that someone asked was about, okay, help me remember, because I'm gonna start jumbling. I haven't answered most of the questions, and so help me out. Remind me of your question, if we haven't addressed it.
I just asked about the opinions of I wouldn't say the native people, but the people who were in Richmond living there before.
Yeah, really great question from two vantage points, both from the natives, people already there, and from the vantage point people who are coming in. Many of them, and we find this out from looking at interviews done with the natives. We've done over 250 interviews with the University of California, Berkeley. And a lot of those are with people who are already here. And they're saying, I like those people, but I hope the Okies and Arkies and the so-and-sos go back, because I want my old town back. I want it to be like it was. So a lot of people are picking and choosing. Some thought, regardless of which people I like, my sweet little town has scaled up. So now when I stop at the grocery store, I no longer feel like chatting with everyone in line, because I don't know them like I did last year. And that just gives me the goosebumps. So for some, they couldn't describe it, but they wanted that small town feeling back. And they had a romantic sense of, if we could get back to that, that's why I dropped anchor in Richmond in the first place. I don't care how you get rid of the rest, but can we please go down to 23,000? I'll just close my eyes and you just wave a wand and make it small town again. Yeah. On the other hand, think about, and here I want to hint at a thread that's over here about gentrification. I want you to think again about this question: how many generations of your family might have grown up in Richmond if one of your elders came here in 1940 or 41? That's long enough for a family and a community and a neighborhood to feel like this is my place. We grew up here. I know her family and her family and her family and his family, and they're beautiful. And we went to the basketball games and the volleyball, and we buried each other's elders. And I remember when da-da-da-da-da. This is memory lane, and it's Jerusalem for a lot of people. You see where I'm going? 70 years is long enough for people to feel like we've always been here. How can you take this place from me? By pricing me out of apartments, by wanting to redevelop this area. So it's something that's temporary, but 70 years long, like a large black presence, where there have been a tiny black presence, a large Latino presence, a large Native American presence, can feel like an eternity and long enough to make a claim on the space of your family memories. And to others it can be like, well, next, someone else should be here by now. So we're hearing now some of the protests and the pain of communities that have been here long enough in Richmond, El Cerrito, Berkeley, Oakland, San Francisco, who can no longer afford to be there. And how do we respond to that Jerusalem claim? What used to be Japantown in San Francisco became Fillmore, the Black Fillmore. Why? Most of San Francisco was not renting to blacks. Most of Oakland was not renting to blacks. Realtors had unwritten, even written rules that they would not rent in most places to blacks, Jews, or Asians. So they'd move into areas where the Japanese had been moved out. So you have a Japanese community claiming this is their place of memory. Then you have a black community And before them, you can find other layers, each feeling like they've been there long enough to make a claim. And so, I need help finding a word for that. I see that as a problem. You know how people do a core sample of the earth? They'll put a big cylinder down, pull it out, or tree rings. They'll see who's there and there. You see? What are some ways we can kind of honor and respect what it meant to them, even if there's someone below them? What do we do? I don't have a single answer for that.
I was just gonna say, like, it made me think about the fact that, well, you know, everyone's on native land, but especially where we are, because, you know, we know a lot about the history. Well, not a lot, but we know about the history of native people who lived here. And kind of like, just honoring or educating yourself about people who lived here before, I think is really helpful. Because when you move on to like the Bay Area, and then you kind of, you're like, oh, this is my place, and you kind of like are ignorant about who was lived here before, and the struggle they went through. I feel it's like, just educate yourself about things.
Thank you. I'm encouraging you to reach for a both and kind of story. A story that puts your people, your interest in the light, but a story that has enough space that you can recognize something meaningful for other people.
We sat with a woman at a Kwanzaa celebration on Wednesday night who is in her early 80s and moved to Richmond from Texas in 1951. And we told her that we were going to be meeting with you, Raphael, and about your work. She was very happy, and she said something similar to what you're saying right now, that it's so important that we learn the histories and the layers of histories, particularly of working people and the people whose hands and work have helped create what we have today. And that generates pride, because work is something that produces a product, and that product lasts, even if it doesn't still exist physically with us. It's changed the economics of it has changed our lives. And so I thought that was really important, what she was saying, and speaks to the work that you do.
I'm so grateful for the way you made that connection. There are so many of us who are teaching or just living here who are encouraging everyone to find a way to recognize multiple threads, multiple lives, multiple investments in the same place of memory and work and thriving. There's moments when the chanting and the sloganing between Black Lives Matter, All Lives Matter feels like a powerful set of position taking. And there's also moments where it feels to me like rock, paper, scissors. There's a way that Black Lives Matter can be exemplary and leading the way, and a way that it can sound like only these. I mean, if you know what those sisters started, then you get past that and see that they're saying, just add us to the mix, please. It's not. We're not trying to trump anybody. And likewise, there's moments when my hearing All Lives Matter sounds like a falsely universal way of saying, pipe down over there, let's think about other people. But also, there's times where I'm calling them out, and I'm saying as a ranger and as a person, walk that walk. If all lives matter, then let's see who was here. Let's honor everyone. I'm waiting, and I'll help you. Let's honor everyone. I want to back away from this Rosie the Riveter story for a second to pass something else out, and invite you into another story, and then come back to this one. I was going to break away and show a different 10-minute movie about the Port Chicago disaster in Concord. Super powerful story. For a lot of the same reasons, even though it's a very different story. One of the things Port Chicago has in common with this story about big temporary national changes is that at first it seems like there's one story that we ought to track, and it's a deep and painful story about a gigantic disaster. But when we back up and ask not only what happened to 50 black men at the center of the story, but what happened, what's at stake for everyone around that disaster? What does that add to the way that we honor the 50, honor the men who went back to work? So I'm going to pass out